In this module of labor economics, we'll take a look at labor unions. Specifically, we'll look at the role and purpose of labor unions. We'll look at trends in unionization of the workforce. We'll look at the effect of labor strikes, and then we'll take a look at some labor market or labor union models. First, let's look at the role and the purpose of labor unions. As we think about the history of American labor, we're really looking at the history of the American labor union. So through this, we have to think about the jobs movement. We've talked a little bit about the jobs movement before. We know that coincident with the Industrial Revolution, we saw that workers were leaving farms and ranches, their own fields, leaving in large quantities the ownership of their own production and going to work at jobs. They were going into factories. They were going into the cities. And as they did this, there was this large surplus of labor coming in, and sometimes labor, as jobs were being created and labor was taking jobs, exchanging their labor for wages instead of simply using their labor at their own jobs with their own firms, so self-employment, owning their production. They were becoming subject to the influences of employers and sometimes subject to some fairly negative influences. We know something of the depravities that took place in some of the early factories, and we know something of the laws and regulations that have been developed over the many decades to try to reduce the negative influences of overzealous firms, profit seekers that were less interested in the long-term care and nature of their workers. Well, as we think about this whole jobs movement, we see at a point in time that labor unions began to arise as ways or as institutions to help offset some of the difficulties brought about for workers by their employers. During the same era, we begin to see that labor unions are more than just an affiliation. They're more than just a membership. They become brotherhoods. I was raised in a union family. I should tell you that. My father and grandfather were proud members of the Carpenters Union in California. My father began his first job as a laborer on a construction site when he was an older teenager. Had to join the union to do this. This would have been in the very early 1950s, late 1940s, and he was proud to become a member of the union. My father remained a member of the construction union, the Carpenters Union, from that point until the end of his life. He lived well into his 60s. He was proud of being a labor union member. He was proud of being a member of the Carpenters Union, a member of the local. The local was how the union was referred to in our home, and he was proud of this. But I have to also admit that the rest of the family wasn't nearly as pleased by some of this, because of the effects of strikes and union dues and some of the other issues that he had to face as being part of that. But the union provided him with a pension. The union provided him with health insurance. The union provided him with benefits at his jobs that he wouldn't have had otherwise, and he loved that. Unions tend to evoke a tremendous sense of passion amongst their members. And I think that this comes back to something that we commonly think about. There's a saying that you don't mess with my income and you don't mess with my family. Well, to a labor union member, the labor union protected the worker's income, and the labor union became somewhat of a de facto or complementary family for labor union members. So it became a group, a brotherhood, far more than a club or just an affiliation. So let's look at labor unions and the job movement a little bit. We can see here the growth and decline of the labor union movement in America from 1890 to 2010. And so as we have people coming in from the farms into the cities, into industry, taking jobs, we see the labor union beginning to pick up as part of our society as well. And here we're seeing on the x-axis, we're seeing time from 1890 through the mid-2006. And on the y-axis, we're seeing the growth and decline of the labor union itself. And these percentages are going to be a percentage of the workforce that is unionized. So we go from about 3% in 1890 to a high of about 36% in 1942, 1943. Now it would look as though this date of 1942, 1943 would be the apex of union power in this country. That's not the case. Even though we see a steady decline in percentage union membership and percentage of union employment in our country, we really don't see the decline in union power until about 1978, 1980. So as I say, the history of American labor is the history of American labor union. I'm talking about how American labor, as it became part of the jobs movement, workers exchanging their labor for a wage, and so we saw labor unions rise as that rose. But then we saw labor unions fall. Membership starting in the early 1940s began to decline, but then also as a percentage of the workforce. But then we also saw influence start to decline in 1978, 1980. But we also saw a number of other very interesting historical events. I just want to point out three different figures in American labor unions that are interesting at this point, because I think it's telling as to some of what labor unions have represented to our society and economy. I believe I've represented Sam Gompers before. Mr. Gompers was the head of the American Federation of Labor in the late 1800s through the early 1900s. He was asked to stand before a House and Senate subcommittee in 1886, and he was asked, "Mr. Gompers, what do you want?" And his response was, "More. We want more wages, we want more health benefits, we want more safety, we want more education." And we went through an entire list of things labor unions want, and then he simply said, "Senator, we simply want more." And that's indicative of labor union attitudes. They're seeking more for their members. They might suggest that in seeking more for their members, they also are able to obtain and provide more for the firms that employ them, because they seek more training, they seek more professionalism, they seek more qualification as well. And if you're a member of a labor union, there's training that you have to have gone through, there's certification that you maybe have gone through. In many cases, there's certainly in the carpenters union, you go from a laborer to apprentice to journeyman to master. And so they're able to show firms that labor union members are better trained, have higher qualifications, and warrant a higher income. Now, that may or may not always be true, but that's what the labor union seeks to do. And Mr. Gompers put this very well: they simply want more. We saw another very interesting figure in American labor in the 1960s and 70s, and that was Cesar Chavez in California. Chavez really was the central force behind the United Farm Workers. And a couple of the more famous or infamous periods for Mr. Chavez's life had to do with the grape boycott, where there were numerous grape growers, grape producers, farmers in Central California who were paying very low wages to their pickers and harvesters. They had very little care to their safety, and so after a period of years of not being able to make any headway with regulatory bodies or with political bodies, Chavez organized a boycott of table grapes in the United States. If you went to a grocer in California in 1965, you probably saw that some grocers were beginning to not carry table grapes, so the kind of grapes that we would eat as fruit, not the grapes that would go into vinegars, not the grapes that would go into wines necessarily, but table grapes. He saw that the vast majority of the public ate grapes, and that if we could accomplish a boycott of grapes, it would put such tremendous pressure on the grape growers that they would bow. And this boycott did extend into grapes for wines and such. In between 1967 and 1970, the grape boycott became so significant that it literally changed the landscape of the grape industry. And most of the growers, or many of the growers, literally went bankrupt in those years. They could not survive the boycott. Most grocers, most packing, canning companies would not touch grapes that were grown by domestic producers because Chavez had become so effective, and this put so much pressure that finally they bowed. There's a movie that was released sometime in the last couple of years titled McFarland, USA, that actually chronicles a little bit of some of the grape region, and so you can see a little bit of some of the activities there. But there's also a movie that was released a few years before about the life of Cesar Chavez that does an effective job of talking about this. It also discusses his hunger strikes. Chavez had a habit of if he couldn't get his way, if he couldn't get what he thought was best for the union, he did not promote violence, although unions and the activities of many within the Farm Workers Union, United Farm Workers, were very violent. He didn't promote these, but he would go on strike, and he wouldn't eat. He wouldn't eat for days, weeks, and literally in the end he wouldn't eat for months. At times trying to prove his point, gaining publicity, seeing to it that the public understood the plight of his union members, and to the point where decisions would be made, people and pressures would bow. He finally passed away in 1993 after a prolonged hunger strike that he was not able to come back from. And then finally we have Jimmy Hoffa. We've all heard of Jimmy Hoffa, a very pivotal figure in the Teamsters Union, which became or was associated with the AFL-CIO. That's the American Federation of Labor, and the AFL-CIO is a very powerful labor union in the United States even today. But it was Mr. Hoffa's reign as a leader within the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters Union that we began to really associate unions and organized crime in this country. It's interesting. We have to perhaps look at why that's the case. Anytime you have a significant number of workers, most of whom are not terribly highly skilled or very highly educated, but who represent a tremendous resource and represent a voting bloc and represent a moneyed source when there's enough of them, then you have motivation for organized crime to come into the picture. Hoffa may or may not have been part of that. He was imprisoned in 1966 as promoting crime or criminal activity within the unions. He was pardoned by President Nixon, I believe it was in 1971, and then he mysteriously disappears in 1975. The expectation is that he was eliminated by some of his competitors within the labor union and by some of the organized crime influences there. But think about labor unions. Labor unions put together pension funds. Labor unions put together political action committees. They put together tremendous amounts of monies. And whenever you have large numbers of people, especially when they are not necessarily terribly highly educated on the whole, and you have tremendous amounts of money, you may create small cracks for organized crime to come into the equation, and that clearly was the case within the Hoffa years. And Hoffa is a mysterious figure even today. So as we think about this, we also have to consider why is it that labor unions end up organizing primarily where we have lower skilled labor and lower educated workers. Well, this comes back to the concept of labor demand elasticity. You'll remember in our demand elasticity section of this course, we talked a little bit about this. We know that when we have an elasticity that is less than the absolute value of -1 or equal to or greater than, we have different forms of elasticity. We have, when it is less than, we consider it inelastic. When it is greater than, we consider it elastic. And when it is equal to, we consider it unitary. Well, what does elastic and inelastic mean? Just as a quick reminder, inelastic would suggest that there's not very many substitutes for the type of labor, and such that when a change in wage is going to yield a smaller change in number of workers. So we know that workers keep their jobs largely if they are highly unsubstitutable when their wages increase. However, elastic workers are very substitutable. They can be substituted by numerous other forms of labor, or they can be substituted by numerous forms of technology. So they're very substitutable. And when the wage changes for a highly elastic worker, then the number of workers in that sector goes down because think about the downward sloping nature of the labor demand curve. And in fact, it goes down disproportionately. It goes down more than the change, such that the elasticity quotient becomes less than the absolute value of -1. Well, think about this. A labor union organizer wants to be able to offer wage gains to their workers without having to have to deal with pesky job losses. So that would suggest that they would prefer to organize the more elastic workers, or rather more inelastic workers in society. However, in our labor force, our labor market, those workers that are very difficult to substitute have a lot of their own power over producers, and because of that, they're in less need of union organization. However, union organizers are willing to organize wherever they can get groups of workers that will collectively make decisions, that will coalesce into a union, pay their dues, and become a bit of a force to reckon with as it comes to bargaining with employers. And this ends up being the more elastic of workers, which means that the lower skilled of workers, the lower educated of workers, and the more subject to some of the problems that we might see within organized crime. The elasticity labor union paradox is that labor unions prefer to unionize those that are more inelastic, but end up unionizing those where there's a fairly high degree of elasticity, such as retail clerks, such as farm workers, such as steel workers, such as auto workers. And these are good people. They may be even very bright people, but on the whole, they aren't the most highly skilled in our economy. They're production workers, they're manual laborers, rather than working through technology, innovation. They tend to be the less highly educated in our workforce. So that's the paradox. They want one, but they end up working with the other, and it's created a crack in here in an area in which organized crime has become very effective and efficient. So what's the role and purpose of a labor union? Well, their role is to represent workers to firms, and sometimes they even become involved in representing the firm to the worker. We have an interesting scenario that really has been playing itself out for the last several years. You might recall that when General Motors went through their bailout and then their organized bankruptcy, that following that bankruptcy, the labor union became one of the major shareholders within General Motors. If we think about the labor union as being a body to represent workers to the firm, what happens when the labor union is the majority owner or one of the majority owners of the firm? If I remember correctly, the labor union owns approximately 40% of General Motors. That's clearly a significant stake. It currently is the highest stake by a large margin. So when the workers need to be represented to the firm, the labor union in this case sits on the side of the table with the workers, but then also the labor union sits on the side of the table with the owners of the firms. So that creates kind of an interesting dynamic, and I'm not sure how this plays out long term. We'll see this over a period of years, but I thought it worth mentioning. The biggest role of the labor union, at least the most visible role, is in collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is where the union will represent workers of a type, say production or manufacturing workers, to numerous firms in seeking labor contracts for them. And they'll seek higher pay, better working conditions, better benefits. They'll seek regulations or rules within the companies and tenets of the contracts to make it more difficult to lay off or terminate union members. And so they seek for the betterment of their workers. They seek to give them more, as Gompers would have suggested, through this collective bargaining process. But they do a little bit more than that. They really are seeking to shift the labor demand curve to the right. Think about this for a moment. If we have our typical labor supply and labor demand relationship in a wage and labor environment, so labor demand and labor supply, giving us some W star and some L star. If we can shift the labor demand curve out to the right, then we find that it motivates increases in both W star and L star. I'll say this is for W prime and L prime. It will increase both of them. Well, that would seem to serve the labor union's purposes very nicely. And in fact, it does. Well, how do they do this? They do this by lobbying. We know that the labor unions in our country are amongst the most effective lobbyists that we have. They're more closely aligned with the Democratic Party than they are the Republican Party. But nonetheless, they will support parties of both, they'll support candidates, political officers of both groups, if those candidates are sympathetic to their needs. And those needs are to find ways to protect jobs of workers and to see to it that that more and more workers are able to be covered by union contracts, and to see to it that more and more contracts require labor unions. So when we think about the increasing scale or scale effects of the shifting of this labor demand to the right, or the lobbying efforts of labor unions, or the efforts of those unions generally, the increasing scale or scale effects has to do with trying to lobby for ways to see to it that more union members are required within private enterprise, and more union members are required within public sector, and in contracts that the public sector might let out to private enterprise. So perhaps a government contract will be let, maybe it's for defense manufacturing, and a labor union lobbyist will try to see to it that that contract must, by legislative edict, include only firms that are unionized or that have union workers working with those firms. That would be an example of the scale effect. Also, we'll try to deal with a substitution effect, or in this case, restricting substitution, and they do this by making it more difficult for workers to be laid off, more difficult for workers to be terminated generally, and sometimes this is simply making it more difficult for those workers to be substituted by some other form of labor, either a non-unionized form of labor, or maybe a form of labor that isn't even human. Maybe it's technological labor, technological innovation. So these are the roles and the purposes of labor unions, a little bit, a tiny bit of their history, but just giving us an indication of how important labor unions are in the American landscape at this point.